He spent 40 years guarding an empty dig site, or so the story goes. The image is simple and strange. A weathered man standing at the lip of a small hole in the sand, returning season after season to a place that most people had written off as nothing. For him, the wait was not idle. It was watchfulness. Decades of careful attention to a place that, at first glance, offered nothing, and yet would reveal a truth no one there had expected. To understand why an empty tomb could matter so much, you have to go back to the long shadow cast by Howard Carter and his discovery of Tutankhamun in 1922. That moment rewired public imagination. The idea that beneath the desert surface lay sealed chambers, glittering equipment, and the intimate objects of a king. Since then, every shaft and crack west of Thebes has been read as a promise of another Carter moment. But archaeology rarely delivers instantaneous theater. It delivers slow persistence, patient sifting, and the occasional quiet miracle of evidence that forces historians to change the map. This story begins not with gold, but with a blue ceiling no wider than a hand's breadth. The site is a dry wadi west of Luxor, a landscape of sun-baked rock and eroded ridges that curve toward the Valley of the Kings. A joint team of foreign and Egyptian archaeologists had been working this area for years, seasons of metal sieves, brushes, and notes under a harsh sky. They had opened dozens of tombs, documented shafts, removed rubble, and slowly rebuilt a picture of who had been buried where in the early 18th dynasty. And then came the hole they kept returning to, an apparently modest burial chamber, emptied in antiquity and reassessed season after season as a curiosity rather than a prize. If you believe the veteran in this story, he first began coming here decades earlier, 40 years becoming shorthand for a lifetime of returns. That language is emblematic. Where documentary records are thin, personal memory fills gaps. Whether he meant a literal 40 years or used the number to describe the scale of his devotion, his presence matters. A single persistent witness to the slow accumulation of evidence that eventually turned an empty room into a key link in an ancient puzzle. The chamber's entrance was famously small, roughly the width of a laptop, about 40 centimeters across, forcing anyone who entered to crawl, hands scraping into the weathered stone. The passage narrowed quickly into a low corridor and then opened into a shallow chamber. It was here, in the dim torchlight, that the sky unfurled. At first, the team saw paint, the kind of paint that archaeologists learn to trust because it carries meaning. A deep, vivid blue laid carefully across the ceiling and punctuated by painted points of light. When you stand beneath a star-studded ceiling in an Egyptian tomb, you are seeing a royal symbol. The Egyptians painted the heavens above certain burials to mark the king's path through the afterlife. That blue, more than anything else in that dusty room, announced rank. This was not a common burial. It was royal. The scene was quietly cinematic. The lead field director, who had shepherded the excavation season after season, stepped inside and did not immediately speak. Tears came. Others in the team felt the catch in their throats too, an emotional mix of vindication, grief for centuries-old losses, and the extraordinary clarity that small, visual cues can bring to a long technical process. But there was also a puzzle. The chamber was empty, not merely without wealth, but lacking even the rough signs of violent looting. No overturned packing, no smashed masonry, no careless destruction. Instead, the emptiness had the look of deliberation. Where the floor had once held jars and linen wrappings, the team found evidence that someone in antiquity had removed materials with care. Under the rubble of the chamber floor, Egyptologists began a recovery practice as old as the profession itself, sieving. They ran dirt through fine meshes, letting wind and patience reveal what careless hands had discarded. The sieve yielded shards, tiny, ordinary things that, in the hands of trained eyes, became extraordinary. Pieces of alabaster jars, broken long ago, bore traces of hieroglyphic inscriptions. The fragments were small. The markings were not instantly legible in the dust, but when conservators cleaned and cataloged them under magnification, the signs emerged, names associated with royalty, the inscriptions linked in part to Thutmose II and to Hatshepsut. This is where the paradox becomes instructive, an empty tomb that points by what has been removed rather than by what remains
to a royal occupant. The archaeologist's interpretation rests on several interlocking pieces of evidence. The blue star-studded ceilings signaled an elite burial context. The lack of violent disturbance and the patterned absence of objects suggested an organized clearing rather than reckless looting. And the jar fragments with royal names tied the chamber to the early 18th dynasty court. Taken together, these clues propose a plausible scenario. The burial had once held a royal assemblage, but some of those objects, and possibly the body itself, had been removed in antiquity and safeguarded elsewhere. Why would priests clear a royal tomb? One historically documented practice helps answer that question. In times of instability or when the flooding of the Nile damaged burial sites, Egyptian priests sometimes relocated royal mummies and valuable funerary goods to hidden caches for protection. One of the best-known examples is TT-320, a reburial cache discovered in the late 19th century that yielded the remains of several royals, including, according to museum records, the mummy of Thutmose II, among others.
Priestly reburial was not an act of vandalism. It was an organized attempt to preserve royal remains and the rituals attached to them. Archaeologists suggest that the tomb in the wadi may have been among those emptied in the wake of flooding or the threat of desecration, its contents guided away by the hands of priests toward more secure places like TT-320. If so, the fragments found in the chamber are not minor traces. They are direct, ephemeral links between an original, now empty resting place and the cache system that later sheltered royal remains. For historians, even the confirmation of such a link matters. It reshapes our maps of burial geography, tells us where pharaohs were interred in the first place, and illuminates the decisions made by ancient custodians when they sought to protect the past. It's important to be cautious here. The discoverers and Egyptian authorities themselves have been measured in their language. Officials describe the find as significant and helpful to understanding the burial pattern of the early 18th dynasty, but they stopped short of grand pronouncements. Archaeology proceeds by accumulation and verification. A shard or two with a royal cartouche is powerful evidence, but it is not an open and shut case for every remaining question. The fragments suggest a connection to Thutmose II and Hatshepsut. They do not by themselves conjure a sealed treasure chamber. They do, however, provide the first funerary object that can be securely associated with Thutmose II's original burial context, and that is a meaningful advance. A brief word about the principal figures. Thutmose II reigned during the 18th dynasty, a formative period in New Kingdom Egypt. His queen and sometimes co-regent Hatshepsut would later become one of the most powerful and historically consequential rulers of the dynasty. Their names on funerary goods suggest courtly ties and help anchor the burial in a specific royal lineage. TT-320, the priestly cache, has long been recognized as one of the places where officials stored mummies and objects to protect them from tomb robbers and environmental damage. Finding pieces of Hatshepsut and Thutmose II's names in an apparently empty chamber strengthens the hypothesis that priests moved sensitive materials from original tombs into caches when conditions demanded it. The technical work that led to these conclusions is worth describing because it displays how discrete actions can change historical narratives. Field seasons there were long and repetitive, trenching, photographing, precise mapping of stone contexts, and the laborious sieving that appears mundane but is often decisive. For 12 years and more, the core team returned again and again to that wadi, patient with the slow revelation of stratified sand. They documented every pebble's place, every scratch on limestone, and every paint flake on the ceiling.
Conservators cleaned shards in controlled conditions. Epigraphers checked signs against corpora of hieroglyphs, and the Ministry of Antiquities reviewed findings before any public statement. The prolonged nature of the project is why the veterans' decades of watchfulness, whether 40 years in the literal sense or not, reads as emblematic. It encapsulates a field ethos where persistence and cumulative attention yield meaning. And then, after all that labor, there was the human moment. The lead director, the veteran who had returned many times to the site, stepped beneath that painted canopy and was overcome. He did not speak the kind of triumphant line an explorer in a movie might deliver. Instead, he let emotion speak for itself. Others on the team, who had sweated and sifted beside him through seasons of setbacks and small triumphs, shared the silence. For archaeologists, discoveries are not merely scientific data. They are confirmations that the practice of careful excavation is a way of honoring lives long past. In that quiet, the team's tears were as much for the person who had been buried and then moved as they were for the slow, unglamorous work that finally connected those material traces. What does this discovery change? For specialists, several things matter. First, it is, as officials have noted, potentially the first set of material remains that can be tied back to Thutmose II's original tomb context.
That alone helps fill a gap in our mapping of early 18th dynasty burials. Second, it offers a clear example of the mechanics of priestly reburial practices, how and why priests might have removed goods from vulnerable tombs and placed them in communal caches. Third, it suggests new targets for future research. If this chamber's items were moved to TT320 or another cache, there may be other original tombs nearby whose contents were similarly relocated, and those original locations might hold more contextual clues even if emptied long ago. Yet the discovery also invites caution. The absence of an intact assemblage in the original chamber does not guarantee the presence of an intact secondary tomb. Many caches themselves had been disturbed or altered across centuries. Objects reburied for safety were later subjected to new waves of theft, environmental damage, or reorganization. Archaeologists are careful to say that while the fragments point towards broader narratives, further excavation, analysis, and corroboration are required before rewriting history textbooks. There is a moral note to this work as well. The finds were handled under the supervision of Egyptian authorities. Conservators documented everything with photographs and accession records, and the team emphasized respect for the dead. The practice of archaeology here is not treasure hunting.
It is an act of stewardship, guided by ethical obligations to preserve cultural heritage in situ where possible, to prevent illicit trade in artifacts, and to ensure that any recovered materials remain part of the public, scholarly record. In the end, the story returns to the man who kept coming back. Whether he used 40 years to mark a precise count of seasons, or as a way of conveying how long the effort felt, his role matters, because narratives, especially those that span decades, rely on witnesses. His watchfulness, the patience to return to a hole in the sand when others had moved on, made him a symbol of an archaeological virtue, faith in process. There is a lesson in that for anyone who loves history. Absence is not always failure. An empty chamber can be as eloquent as an overflowing one. The manner in which things were removed, the traces left behind in dust, the blue of a ceiling, the scratch of a hieroglyphic sign on a broken jar, these are the grammar of the past, speaking in small syllables. Sometimes the past speaks most clearly through what it has chosen to hide. If this story appeals to you and you want to follow the unfolding work at the frontier of archaeology, subscribe to this channel for more careful, evidence-based stories from the field. Archaeology will keep asking questions here. Will another sieve unearth a new fragment? Will comparative analysis of inscriptions yield a smoking gun linking this chamber to a known cache? Will the maps of early 18th dynasty burials be redrawn? For now, the find reshapes how scholars think about where kings of that era were first laid to rest, and how their custodians reacted when time or water threatened those places. The more intimate takeaway, however, is human. The image of a man returning to an empty hole, patient enough to believe that absence could speak, and the team that honored that belief by following evidence through years of small labor until the truth, or at least a clearer truth, came out. Archaeology rarely offers certainties. It offers instead a sequence of better-informed possibilities. Each shard, each painted star, each careful record brings us closer to understanding the choices of people who lived 3,000 years ago. Share this story with someone who loves history, and if you'd like to read more about the excavation and the official statements, check the links in the description, where the Ministry of Antiquities and the excavation team's reports are available. For now, the painted sky of a forgotten chamber stands as a reminder that patience, care, and respect for the past can turn an empty place into a profound piece of history.